Welcome back again, this time session 12. When we finished session 11, we realized that something had to have occurred to explain the presence of such a following that Jesus has today in the world. It is the largest following. It cannot be explained by what we saw in the last session, by such a horrible start to life, the shortest ministry, and the worst ending. There had to be something that occurred for us to explain it. And that is why this session starts off with saying, what happened after death? In Hinduism, there's creation, mourning, and scattering of the ashes over and into the river Ganges or Ganga, the holy river, signifying a merger with the eternal. And after that, memorials and shrines are erected, and then what that individual has done is passed over to another who then carries on the tradition. And the writings get more and more complicated and complex, and the ideas get expounded even better. In Buddhism, after he died, for some days, those who were around him worshipped the relics, whatever was left, with devotion, and then divided those relics into 8 parts. They gave them to 7 kings who would go back to their own kingdoms, and then those kings would go back and take those relics and erect what is called stupas or memorial mounds in their towns and in their kingdoms. And once Gautama Buddha was gone, other monks took over his job and ran the monasteries that were set before. In Islam, Muhammad died. The next leader took over. His name was Abu Bakr, who ruled or was the caliph for 2 years, and then another took over, Umar, followed by the third, Uthman, and then the fourth, Ali. So what we see here is once a leader, the founder, has gone, the others come in and take over, and the movement continues with the help of the next leader. In Judaism, the story is the same. After the death of Moses, it came to pass that the Lord spoke to Joshua, the son of Nun. So Moses died and somebody else took over. Joshua took over. In each of these conditions, it's the same pattern. The person dies, they revere him, honor him, lay him to rest, and then somebody else takes over. When you come to the 5th, Christianity, to Jesus, look at these words. I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Nobody else is going to take over now. Wow. In fact, he says, I am he who lives, I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore, and I have the keys of Hades and of death in my hands. That is an amazing claim. Our first inclination is to just dismiss it as a mythological story. Yes, if you and I are rational thinkers, that's the way we would think. But remember, we asked ourselves to be inquirers. And an inquirer will always look at other possibilities as well. So here is how we're going to look at it. The meaning of resurrection is philosophical, is religious, is Christian, doctrinal. But whether it really took place is not at all religious. It is just historical. Here we come to the sharp focus of the first principle we mentioned when we started out by saying that we are going to look at the story, the para-religious factors, not the doctrines and philosophies. We are looking at the story on which the doctrines are based. Thus, if the story is credible, the religious doctrines have a base and become believable. So here's the question. Can the story of the resurrection of Jesus be established to any reasonable degree as a real physical event, or is it only a fabricated myth? Here's what Wolfert Pannenberg from Germany said. Whether the resurrection of Jesus took place or not is a historical question. In other words, it's not a religious belief question. It is a historical question, and so the question has to be decided on the level of historical argument, not a belief, not a philosophy, but look to see if it is historically a reliable story. So why not just dismiss it? Why even look at it? Well, there are two reasons. Number one, as an inquirer, we already saw that this story is written in the best attested historical piece of literature. If it was mythological or legendary, there would be no problem in just tossing it aside. But because it is in a historical piece of literature, we cannot toss it aside without giving it a good reason. Even though it's unbelievable, yes, we recognize, but we cannot throw it aside. Number two, it's a huge claim. So it's so big that it's either the greatest miracle or the greatest delusion which history records. When you say something that big, question of whether it is true or false. If it is true, wow. And if it is not true, oh, horrible. That's the difference, and that's why we're going to look at it. Now, it happened 2,000 years ago. How can we check to see whether it was a reliable story? I was wondering about it until I read these words by Wilbur Smith. Let it be simply said that we know more about the details of the hours immediately before and the actual death of Jesus than we know about the death of any other one man in all the ancient world. We know more about the burial of the Lord Jesus than we know of the burial of any single character in all of ancient history. Those are quite stunning words. Kings, emperors, mighty military generals have died. Jesus was kind of like a barefoot itinerant preacher from the backwaters of Galilee. How do we know more about his death and burial than all the others put together? How do we know more about him than about the death of, say, Napoleon or Julius Caesar or any of the pharaohs? But that is what we find, a good description of what happened at the death and what happened at the burial. So it gave me confidence that I could probably look at the story. And if the author is in question, we might be able to pick out the points and decide whether this is really reliable, has a good base, or very suspect. And here we follow Aristotle's dictum, who said, "The benefit of the doubt is to be given to the document itself, not arrogated by the critic to himself, because the critic was not there." If the author was probably there, and we saw that in the New Testament the authors were right there, they were eyewitnesses. So we cannot really dismiss their story without giving it a good chance. So John Warwick Montgomery also expounded on this, and he said, "One must listen to the claims of the document under analysis and not assume fraud or error unless the author disqualifies himself by contradictions or known factual inaccuracies." So here's what we are faced with. If the story is unbelievable, which it really is to a rational thinker, then what could the correct story be? Because something happened. And the reason it is unbelievable, because it strains our rational thinking, it strains our sense of reasoning. So suppose we put another story, we should not strain our sense of reasoning again, otherwise we would have jumped from the pan into the fire again. So we must look for a good explanation if we want to toss this story aside. Philosopher David Hume's criterion, now he was a secular philosopher, in other words, he didn't really believe in miracles. So this is what he said: "A miracle may be believed only if we find that the arguments and explanations produced to show that it is not true are more unbelievable than the story itself." In other words, disproving the miracle would require an explanation even more unbelievable than the miracle itself. Or any alternate story proposed is even more unbelievable, a greater miracle. So with that, let's look at what they have proposed as alternatives. There are many. It can be boiled down to about two. Number one, he did not die. He only fainted. It's called the swoon theory. There was so much of blood loss, his blood pressure came down and he fainted. The people thought he was dead and they put him into the tomb and he rose up from there because he was not dead. The swoon theory. Number 2 is the theft theory. He did die, but he did not rise. The disciples or whoever came and stole the body. Let's look at these 2 propositions. First, he did not die. That means he only swooned. So it's called the swoon theory. There are 5 points we're going to look at one by one. Who made sure that he was dead? Pilate did. Pilate was alive at that time. He was the governor at that time. Look at the words. Pilate marveled that he was already dead. Now there's a ring of truth to this because he marveled. Why would Pilate marvel? The story is this. He was crucified, and then the friends and relatives of Jesus came to Pilate and said, please give us the body so that we can bury it. Give him an honorable burial. And Pilate marveled that he was already dead. Why would he marvel? Because crucifixion takes days, not hours. Some have stayed on for 2-3 days. Some have been known to hang there for 7 days before dying. And here in 6 hours you say he is dead? So can you see why Pilate would have marveled? And therefore what did he do? Summoning the centurion, he asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. So who made out that he was dead? Who made sure? Pilate. How did he make sure? He asked the centurion. How did the centurion make sure? We have the story. When they, the soldiers, came to Jesus hung on the cross, they saw that he was motionless and appeared dead. Now, the friends and people of Jesus wanted the body. Pilate wants to know whether he is dead so that they could give him the body. And here the centurion looking at the body, looks dead, but how do you know he is dead? And he is not going to bring down the body unless it's dead. So he does the only thing he could possibly think of. He called a soldier with his spear and said, one thrust onto that body to make sure that the body is dead. Those who have looked at it and studied it say that if he didn't die of crucifixion, he would have died of that spear thrust. That it was what it was meant to do, kill. And the Roman soldiers were the most trained soldiers in the world. They were trained to fight against enemies who were also soldiers. How easy to kill a person who is motionless and just hanging on the cross. One thrust. Now we know why the spear was thrust, to make sure he was dead. That was number 2. Number 3, John, the writer, who was a witness, says, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. He who has seen has testified. What is the meaning of blood and water? Well, I'm a physician, so I was looking for a physiological explanation for that. Have you heard of the expression, broken-hearted individual? Yep. Are they happy or sad? They're sad. Broken-hearted. Do you know where that came from? One of the ways that expression came was from the experience that people had in the good old days when they found that 2 people who were, say, deeply in love, very close to each other, couldn't do without one another, and then they were forced to separate. They would notice that sometimes one of the partners died without a known cause. So people would wonder, how come the person died? They would do a post-mortem, and at post-mortem they would find that the heart muscle had ruptured. Grief, pain, sorrow and stress could come to such a degree that the heart muscle would just rupture. So it's possible that Jesus' heart muscle ruptured. Now if the heart muscle ruptures, where will the blood go? It will collect in the sac called the pericardial sac. The heart is surrounded by a sac. When that happens, the blood is now in the sac, gushing out from the heart. It fills the sac, so the pressure in the sac goes up and presses down on the muscle, and the muscle then can't even pump. So the heart stops and the patient dies. Now what happens to the blood in the sac? It will mix with the pericardial fluid and it will partially clot. partially clotted blood. The clotted portion will come down to the bottom and leave the upper part, which is now called the serum, without any of the red blood cells, the white blood cells and the platelets. So it's clear and it's called serum. So it will come down in two parts. The bottom, red, clotted blood, the one on top, clear serum. If the spear had hit at the junction, we would have two streams coming out. But remember, two things have to happen. The blood has to stop flowing. That's number one. And it has to stop flowing for some time. It doesn't happen very quickly in a minute or two. So when you see two streams, and John saw that, he didn't know about serum, so he used the word water. So when we look at that today, we can deduce two things. The blood had stopped flowing. And number two, it had stopped flowing for some time. Remember exactly what Pilate asked the centurion? Was he dead for some time? So that's what we see in this third point. Number four is, if he just fainted and was put into the tomb, how did he get out of the tomb? Look at the questions that come up now. Number one, how did he unwrap the grave clothes, which are actually strips? Number two, how did he find his way to the door in the darkness of the tomb? Number three, how did he break the seal which was on the outside of the tomb while he was on the inside? Number four, how did he roll away the stone? In Aramaic, it's called golel. Golel means a large stone, and when you study the word and look at how they used it, it would require anywhere from 3 to 15 people to move it. And here we're saying an individual who was half an individual, how could he have moved that golel? His hands were pierced. And after a few hours, the wound would be really swollen and absolutely painful. How did he use his hand? Well, he could have used his shoulder maybe. But if he used his shoulder, then he would have to push with his feet. His feet were also pierced. There's no way he could have pushed that golel away from the door of the tomb. And even if he did, was it so well greased and lubricated so that it didn't make a sound? Think. It would have made a grating, crunching sound. So none of the guards knew that. How do we explain? Just silent activity? How do we explain also the fact that the guards were right there? They were all went to sleep and all derelict in their duty at the same time? That seems preposterous, right? All of them at the same time, exactly when he was coming out? And really, look at the condition of his body, pierced in the hands and the feet, his back lashedness, just seething mass of bloody tissue there, his torso, body thrust with a spear. How could he have come out and escaped from the tomb? The most I think we can imagine him doing was just crawl out. None of the disciples, none of the soldiers caught him. That's hard. So, number four, how did he get out? We don't know. Number five, multiple testimonials. Pilate was convinced Jesus was dead. The centurion was convinced Jesus was dead. Even his friends were convinced. How do we know? They brought embalming material. Look, nobody embalms a body that is alive. Why? Because the embalming material is so toxic that it will kill the body. So nobody brings embalming material to embalm a body unless it is gone and dead. So we have today no reasonable grounds to dispute the question. Jesus most likely was well and truly dead. How about the body stolen? Here again 5 points. The report that the soldiers gave was this: his disciples came at night and stole him away while we slept. Now one reading of that story will tell you it's false. Why? Because you cannot be awake and asleep at the same time. If you were asleep, how do you know the disciples came and stole him? Was one of your eye open? No. So when you say you were asleep, you cannot say the disciples took him. So the story is inconsistent internally. Externally also the report is inconsistent because the soldiers were armed, not the disciples. So in both ways, it's an inconsistent report. Number two, the story says that there were some folded clothes inside the tomb. Look, we are accusing these disciples of being thieves. They came and robbed the grave. A theft scene is not orderly. It's always helter-skelter. We don't go and steal and say, well, before we take off with our booty, let's fold some clothes. Nobody does that. In other words, thieves don't make good house helpers. They don't fold clothes. Number three, remember what we said about the person crucified. The Romans stripped them naked to heap the maximum amount of shame on the body. The story here says that the clothes were all inside the tomb. Therefore, the theory must be that the disciples took out a naked body. Think of it. Why would they do that? If you and I were going to steal something, and if it's all nicely wrapped and packed for us, wouldn't you and I just pick it up and run? Bolt? Why sit there unwrapping? There is no explanation that is possible for unwrapping, because the soldiers were right there, a few yards away. Why would you sit and unwrap? Just take it and go. And also, no follower of a guru or a shishya in the East will ever hint of exposing the nakedness of his master. No, sir. That's a psychological hurdle we cannot cross. They could not have done that. So the story actually loses its significance right there. The credibility falls flat. No follower would have done that. And number four, the same thing as Jesus coming out from the tomb. How did the disciples enter into the tomb? What was the method? No convincing practical method of entry by the disciples into the tomb has ever been described. The guards were stationed there for only one purpose written in the record: prevent theft. How did they allow that theft to occur? There is no plausible explanation. Number five, when we accuse a person of a crime, and if we go to a court of law, the primary thrust of your case is that there is a motive. Without a motive, it's very hard to pin a criminal activity. So, what was the motive that the disciples had? The more you think about it, the more you realize that they had no motive. They did not know that Jesus was going to rise up from the dead. If they had, they wouldn't have denied him or even fled from him. And they did that when he was alive. Did they become bold after he died? That's again a psychological dispute there. We are doing it the wrong way. So there cannot be a good story without a motive if it is theft that took place. There was no way they could have thought ahead and said, well, let's make up a story of his resurrection. No motive, no crime. So here's what we find. Non-miraculous explanations of what happened at the empty tomb have to face a cruel choice. Either they have to rewrite the evidence to suit themselves, or they have to accept the fact that they are not consistent with present evidence. In other words, Cordovan says this: if you look at the story and the details of the story, and if you then try to make another theory than the actual resurrection story, then you will come to clash with the evidence that we find in the writing. Or you make up a story that's even more unbelievable than the story. Remember what philosopher David Hume said? A miracle may be believed only if we find that the arguments and the explanations produced to show that it is not true are even more unbelievable than the miracle itself. Or in other words, disproving the miracle would require an explanation even more unbelievable than the miracle itself. Or any other alternative story proposed is even more miraculous than the original one. So now when we look at this, both the swoon theory, in which we say he just fainted and then he came out from the tomb by himself, as well as the theft theory, which says that the disciples came and stole the body while the guards all slept, these two require more miracles. In other words, in number, multiple miracles. I hope you saw that. Than the one miracle which is the resurrection story. Therefore, if you and I want to be rational, reasonable thinkers who don't believe in miracles at all, then we would have to first disband or dismiss the swoon theory and the theft theory, because they are even more miraculous, and then come to decide about the resurrection story. Because something did happen. We cannot explain the Christian church from a point in which its founder was done to death as a condemned criminal and publicly humiliated, put to utter shame, and found that in their own writings, this person who was hanged was actually cursed of God. How will anybody follow him? So when we look at the story, the swoon theory and the theft theory really do not stand up to scrutiny. Now, that's on the side of those alternative stories. We have another question left then. If the story is really true, do we have evidence for that? And that is what we are going to see next. So stay tuned. We will go to our final session to decide and look into that.
If you have enjoyed this presentation with Dr. Subodh Pandit and wish to watch more of this unique 13-part series for free online, visit the website godfactorfiction.com. That's godfactorfiction.com. If you would like to order this fascinating series on DVD, it is now available from Whitehorse Media. To order from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. Dr. Subodh Pandit has written 2 eye-opening books entitled Come Search With Me, Does God Really Exist? And Come Search With Me, The Weight of Evidence, which further explore the topics of evolution, theism, atheism, and religion. To order these books from within the U.S., call 1-800-782-4253. That's 1-800-782-4253. If you live outside the U.S., you may also easily order them on Amazon.com.